I have been looking for the last 3 years at overseas Navy and Army laboratories, like the Naval Area Medical Research Units and the U.S. Armed Forces for Research Institute of Medical Science in Thailand. And I've been doing that on behalf of, or sponsored by, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is interested in finding out about what makes emerging infectious disease surveillance work, or why, more precisely, it doesn't work so well in different countries, developing countries. And the interest there is really because, diseases cross borders, and we need to know as far in advance as possible when something is going to happen and when it goes from an animal to a human being, so zoonosis of diseases. I've spoken at conferences like TED, I participate in the World Economic Forum, and I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But let me start off this talk by asking you if you know what non-traditional security threats are. Raise your hand if you do. Okay, a couple of you. And if I could ask you to shout out what some of these threats are, for example. I'm sorry? Okay. Disease, all right, great. Anything else? The weather, right, natural disasters. So I'll be just talking briefly about all these things and then getting into the work that I do on pandemics and emerging infectious diseases. So we know that terrorism, for example, is a non-traditional security threat, right? So the Bali bombing in 2002, I was working in East Timor at the time, and it's the only way to get into Timor were through Bali or through Darwin, and so it certainly was quite concerning. A lot of Australians died. The perpetrators were caught, and certainly the threat still looms there of terrorism in Southeast Asia. The other concern, of course, is narcotics, cartels, drugs, and the path through which these drugs go. Starts off, say, the Golden Crescent, Golden Triangle, goes to the U.S. Even inside Asia, there's a lot of activity. Then there's piracy, which I'll talk about some more in my South China Sea talk later. Lots of instances of piracy in Asia, especially in the Strait of Malacca, where, as of 2004, there were 37 attacks. The number of reported piracy attacks have been really quite significant in the Gulf of Aden, but if you look at this breakdown, Vietnam gets 11, Indonesia 28, Bangladesh 12. So Asia is still a big location for these attacks. 7 pirates arrested after robbing tanker's crew. This is in the Borneo Post. Another concern from non-traditional security threats is human trafficking. And by that, I don't mean necessarily just sex trafficking, but that is certainly a big problem. It's also bondage. Just one of the statistics is that we are now apparently at a higher level of slavery, or there's more slavery in the world today than there's ever been in the past, if one defines slavery as basically working for free. And the pathways of human trafficking are inter-Asia and outside of Asia as well. So you've got the sale of girls, you've got sex trafficking, and then you've got, of course, the problem of pollution. And that's true whether you believe that pollution is connected to global warming or climate change, whether it's anthropomorphic, caused by humans or not, but it's a problem nonetheless, right? So cities in Asia are facing the consequences of pollution. I think in China, the embassy or one of the consulates somewhere was keeping track of pollution, and the Chinese did not appreciate that. It was like, you don't need to tell people about our problems. But the real issue for countries like the Maldives, for example, wouldn't you like to be there, is that they could disappear with rising waters. I mean, these are barely islands as it is, and the problem is that if you end up with just a foot higher water elevation, you could end up losing a bunch of atolls. So you don't want a situation like this where we're now in the second and last phase of implementing our adaptation plan. As you can see the background, those rafts will be used to evacuate the last remaining people on the island. You also have the problem of weather, as we mentioned earlier. So certainly flooding, the water security in the sense of controlling Mother Nature in a way that changes the flow of water and can cause droughts in other places downriver. And of course, the problem of hunger, which in Asia certainly remains serious. You've got several red spots there, and most of China is still in the orange area of 10 to 19% undernourished. So most of China, large parts of Southeast Asia. Despite, of course, bumper crops at times in rice harvesting. In 2008, I was on the USNS Mercy lecturing on the rice crisis. The price of rice had gone up several folds in 2008, and so you had a problem where countries were banning the export of rice because they were concerned about food security. Then you have, of course, cyclones and earthquakes, for example. This is Cyclone Nargis. Earthquakes here mapped out for Japan and different parts of Asia. And the consequences of these is tremendous. I mean, you can see here from the earthquake that took place in Japan that the tsunami took a significant toll on the cities. And of course, Fukushima Daiichi, as a consequence of that, the nuclear plant. You also have a problem there of energy security, where the concern would be that the competition for resources, certainly in the South China Sea, would lead to conflict, both for natural gas and oil. And all of this, of course, feeds into electricity, which powers most of modernization, development, and so on. So here's a map of the world, an electrified sort of the lights at night of the world. And you can see here for a cutout of Asia, South Korea, and that black hole up there, North Korea, which has no lights except for a little bit in Pyongyang. So that feeds into the electrical, well, not enough lights. Not enough, the electrical grid, which we're always told is seriously vulnerable to cyber attacks. And of course, that's true of everything nowadays, including banks being vulnerable, as well as being vulnerable from bankers themselves. So the topic is really going to be, the focus of my talk is really going to be on diseases, and there I want to focus on sort of the pathogens that are increasingly apparent in emerging and re-emerging diseases throughout Asia. And so you're going to see, actually, here's a map of the world here, and you can see that in most of Asia you have really a high density of population, and the diseases that we've observed, like bird flu, SARS, Nipah virus, Hendra virus, are all coming from Asia. But there are, of course, other concerns elsewhere in the world. I mean, Africa is a hotspot for other diseases as well, West Niles, for example. The research I'm going to talk to you about in the next few minutes is actually just published recently in the Asian Security, a referee journal, and it's on the sort of the surveillance work that was done in Cambodia and Indonesia by the Naval Area Medical Research Unit 2 lab. So you don't need to read this. I'll just give you sort of the scoop on what I found. And I'll do this in 5-6 parts. I'll talk about the problems that are faced in emerging infectious disease surveillance, the sort of the timeline and context of the work that was done, talk about the Indonesia case study, the Cambodia case study, and bring in the fact that H1N1 came up, as well as actually a recent outbreak of Enterovirus 71 in Cambodia, which killed 60 kids, and then conclude with some thoughts. So what's the problem in much of the developing world, including Asia? Well, you've got poor to non-existent surveillance, poor diagnostic lab capacity, disincentive to report, and this problem of viral sovereignty. How many of you have heard of viral sovereignty as a problem? No? Never heard of that? Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about that then. So viral sovereignty is this idea that a country's virus is its property. You know, it's like its intellectual property. It's found in its borders, so it can't just leave without permission from the government. And the real, you know, it's explained in this excerpt here from a report of the Institute of Medicine as in 2006, Indonesia claimed viral sovereignty over samples of H5N1 collected within its borders and announced that it would not share them until the World Health Organization and developed countries established an equitable means of sharing the benefits, vaccine, that would derive from such viruses. So what happened was that Indonesia, you know, gave some samples of a virus to CDC. I think it did this through NAMRU. And for whatever reason, they got out into the private sector. And then the Minister of Health was met one day by a pharmaceutical firm rep who wanted to sell her a vaccine from that virus for, you know, millions of dollars. And she thought this was outrageous because they don't have the technology to create the vaccine, but they're being kind of held ransom as a result of their inability to create the vaccine. And you know, one can look at it from the global public health standpoint, which is, this is outrageous. You can't keep a vaccine from being shared. It needs to be given to the international community so that we can address the problem before it becomes serious. Or you can look at it from the standpoint of the country, which by the way, includes countries like Thailand, where, you know, the stance is pretty much supportive of Indonesia, that just because you, the West, have got the technology to create a vaccine doesn't mean you should hold it ransom and say, look, you know, we created this vaccine, now give us hundreds of millions of dollars to give it back to you. So they're playing hardball, and it's kind of, you can kind of see both sides of the equation there. It was actually apparently an Australian pharmaceutical firm that somehow or was able to make the vaccine for that. And you know, the details are sketchy, to say the least. But it should not have gotten out. I don't think. It was not part of the plan of anyone, but a mistake was made somewhere along the way. The other problem, of course, was that NAMRU 2 was publishing articles in journals and labeling the samples that were examined Indonesia 1, Indonesia 2, Indonesia 3, and it was obvious to the Indonesians that obviously something from Indonesia was taken out and tested for the purposes of the study. Of course, their reaction would be that there were co-authors who were Indonesian government officials on the paper. Of course, how much work the co-authors really did is a matter of debate. And just because you have a co-author who's Indonesian in the government doesn't mean that the government said okay to it necessarily. So it gets a little complicated on that. And actually what happened at the latest World Health Assembly meeting was that Indonesia agreed or signed in principle a new sort of resolution that said that, yeah, they'd be willing to share, they're no longer going to behave this way, but, you know, have we seen the next instance of some virus that absolutely has got to be taken out of Indonesia and tested? Not necessarily. So we don't know whether the actions are going to follow the words. But yeah, I think the concern for agencies like DITRA and others is the potential for weaponizing, but also the potential for just naturally occurring diseases. Most of the diseases we see and observe in humans today came from animals. So we've got to be on the lookout. And the animals are supposed to be the canaries in the coal mine, but they end up being, you know, they don't die from the disease, and we die from the disease, right? So that's what happened with the Nipah and Enterovirus, which is found in bats. They don't seem to have any problem with it. It's like a cold to them. Then it went over to pigs, and then over to humans, and then a bunch of people died. Okay, so the problem is also that in the poorest countries, per capita expenditure on all of healthcare is really low. It's like 3% of what high-income countries spend. And 90% of the staff in the labs that do all this testing or are supposed to do all this testing are actually not familiar with quality assurance principles. 60% of the labs have equipment that's outdated or not functioning. Now, this was a GAO, Government Accounting Office report from 2001. So it's been over a decade, and one would think that things have changed since then. But I checked with a director of lab systems development at a major American university, and he said, from my experience, this is in 2010, countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, I believe the status has not changed much from the date of the 2001 GAO report. So it remains a real concern that these countries are not really, especially the ones that are quite poor, like Cambodia, are not really able to do the work needed to identify pathogens, much less the regular diseases like tuberculosis, for example, which we already know about, obviously. So just to give you a timeline and some context here, you've got Spanish flu. The opening slide to my presentation was one from the 1918 Spanish flu. Then you've got various viruses from 1957 to 2004. It stops in 2004, but there's more going on after that. But you've got various iterations of different viruses from the Hong Kong flu to bird flu, H5N1. And then, of course, in 2009, you have H1N1 swine flu. But that was really turned out not as deadly as we had feared, which only, I think, for a lot of Mexicans, based on the research I've done, made them feel that this was just a political thing. There was an election beforehand. Somebody made a big deal out of this and won the election as a result. But it's hard to say. And I looked at that later, and I'll talk about that some more in a few minutes. So what's the downside to globalization when it comes to diseases? Well, you can have a disease come out of a hotel in Hong Kong, the Metropole Hotel, and a doctor from Guangzhou dies on the floor in the lobby of the hotel. 16 other people get the disease. One of them ends up on a plane, goes to Canada, and Canada ends up being the second most affected country in the world from SARS. So SARS here in 2003 was a real eye-opener for a lot of people. I mean, this idea that you can just put a passenger on a plane and then they can bring the disease to a new continent. The fact is, this is all matched up with quality of healthcare that is really poor. Now, this is in 2002, but you've got large parts of Asia here in red, which is categorized as unsuitable. Countries with the least developed healthcare infrastructure, medical care and pharmaceuticals generally are unavailable or depend on humanitarian organizations. In the first case of bird flu in Cambodia in humans was found, for Cambodia, was found in Vietnam. So Vietnam discovers the first Cambodian case of bird flu because the patient was so sick she went over to Vietnam and died there, and then they're the ones who are faced with telling the Cambodians that actually one of your citizens has got this disease. And then her brother died before her, and he was cremated, so they don't even know if he probably was the first patient, the first person, index case. In Laos, you had a situation recently where it was the same thing. Thailand discovered a case of a disease, and they didn't know how to politically react to this because it's like, we don't want to embarrass our neighbor with the fact that their health infrastructure is so poor that they can't figure out what's going on around them. So why are we seeing this? Well, you're seeing this because in countries like Cambodia and Indonesia, people live with animals. I mean, they have a couple of chickens in the backyard, and oftentimes the chickens come with them in the house. And in these urban settings, disease can spread quickly. So let's talk a bit about Indonesia and the case of NAMRU 2, that Naval Area Medical Research Unit Lab 2. And really, after 40 years of operating in Indonesia, the lab, which had the best technology one could imagine for Indonesia. And some of the top scientists in the world really was not able to stick around. It was kicked out after 40 years. And when I spoke to the commanding officer, the impression I had was that it was all because of this woman here, the Minister of Health, who was essentially had an axe to grind against the lab or whatnot and wanted it out. But I think the narrative is too tempting to position only as one person against an entire sort of organization. When I interviewed people, the kinds of key issues that came up involved, for example, poor host-donor relationship, which you would expect. After all, they got kicked out. But you also have differing host and donor priorities. So, for example, Namru2's priorities might have deviated from what the country, Indonesia, wanted. Maybe your focus is too much on certain diseases that are of interest to service members, which of course is why Namru2 is there. But then Indonesia might be interested in other diseases that are of higher burden to their population. You also had poor levels of compensation for the government lab technicians, and then decline in Ministry of Health quality, for example. So there are a lot of reasons, but just to sum up a few here, certainly money was a problem, quality was a problem, and then you had here publish or perish. I say this because like in a lot of situations, the labs, they operate on the basis of publications, partnerships, and products, the 3 Ps. And on the publications front, maybe the pressure was very strong on the scientists there to put out more research. As I mentioned, the Indonesia 1, 2, 3 examples, for the viral samples. Well, when you have a lot of pressure to publish, maybe you don't talk to your host that much, or you don't involve them as much in the work that's done. And as a result, you can have problems. And also the kinds of people who work at Namru2 might have changed over the 40 years that it was there. Early on, it was more senior scientists. Later on, it was more junior scientists. And so the junior people want to publish a lot in order to burnish their credentials, but the senior people early on didn't need to. They were already established. Let me just go over the Cambodia case portion of it and start off with this gentleman here, a very lucky guy, the first person to survive avian influenza, highly pathogenic avian influenza in Cambodia. And he was discovered by a sentinel testing done by Namru2 in Cambodia. He went into a hospital one day, wasn't feeling well. They took his blood, probably gave him a bag of noodles for his troubles. And then a couple of weeks later discovered that his blood had avian influenza in there, virus. And so they managed somehow to find him and put him in a hospital and give him the care that he needed to survive. So he's the first to survive. And then the next victim, the next person, he was number 10, and 9 people had died before that, discovered only after they'd already gone, their health had already deteriorated too far. The next person was also, as it happens, discovered by Namru2 through another sentinel test, and also lived. So, you're seeing the pattern here. Namru2, very lucky, right, if you get found by them. I think the only other person, a child of like 3 years of age to have survived was, now you're up to like 20 people dead, was a girl who went to a hospital financed by foreign aid. So nothing to do with actual government facilities, always something to do with foreigners doing something in Cambodia that ends up having the quality of care needed. So I mentioned the sort of the canary in the coal mine. So the idea of surveillance is really one where, you would get the animals when they're sick, and then you would catch them before they actually make people sick, right? So find where the animals are sick, and find, kill them before they transmit their disease, and humans won't die as a result. So that's the idea of how, if you were to catch if you were to do surveillance effectively, you would get animal outbreaks first, and then you get human outbreaks first. So you can see here from 2004, these are mapped out the animal outbreaks, and here is the human victims from 2005 to 2008, and you can kind of see it's sort of in the same areas. The only problem is that humans have been more like the canaries, where they're the ones who are found dead, and then the Ministry of Agriculture goes in and kills the animals because it's like, okay, well, we have to do something about this. A bunch of people died. We have to find the culprit for this. And that's not really what we want. I mean, what we want are farmers reporting that there's been some suspicious deaths in their flocks, and now please come in and investigate this. And why isn't it working? Well, it's not working because the Cambodian government, in its infinite wisdom, comes in and kills your birds and gives you nothing in exchange. So are you really going to call the Cambodian government when there's a problem? I mean, unless you want to go bankrupt, you can. So that's kind of the problem. You know, killing poultry without compensation is not leading to the outcome one would hope. Now, with respect to the issues I found in Cambodia, some of the similar things that I discovered in Indonesia, you know, poor pay for government lab techs, for example. It's a country that's very aid dependent. Cambodia, I've got a book coming out later this year called Aid Dependence in Cambodia, How Foreign Assistance Undermines Democracy. And I find in there that for the net aid received by Cambodia, for essentially, you know, net foreign aid received as a percentage of government spending, it's 94.3%. So it's almost 1-to-1. They receive $1 and they spend $1. As in the name of the government. It's not quite saying that, you know, all of the money comes from aid, because they also tax, and the amount of taxes that they receive is almost equal to, I think it's probably the difference between the 94.3% and the 100%. So I actually think that if, in the grand scheme of things, it just means that for every dollar it receives, it uses one of its own dollars to spend on itself. So it's really more like 50% in the sense of 1-to-1, right? So in the grand scheme of things, it's like 50% of the overall budget is kind of matched by donors. Hope that makes sense. And so you've got no compensation for culling, for example, as a problem of how the Cambodian government handled the problem of avian influenza in Cambodia and really disincentivized reporting. The other problem was that a lot of the donor countries which gave money to Cambodia were really interested in how to obviously prevent the disease from coming to their shores, right? So you're not necessarily interested in making things better in Cambodia. You just want Cambodia to be able to figure out what is going on so that it can stop it from going abroad. And so some of the policies, maybe this idea of killing poultry without paying the farmers, the donor countries normally would have objected to that, and they did, but they really didn't want to put up too much of a fight, so they accepted that. But the problem is that once they accepted that, then they basically agreed to not make it very effective as a result. So there's not really any detection. In fact, when you look at animal outbreaks in the year plus before the election in Cambodia, there are no outbreaks. It's as if Cambodia is disease-free or something. And then suddenly, right after the election, more outbreaks suddenly. So you can see the politicization of sort of reporting on disease outbreaks in Cambodia when it comes to H5N1. Now, the patronage issue, right? So it's really quite simple. See the black square there? That's the prime minister. And he is the father of all these kids who are all married to all these people, and their parents or their in-laws or whatnot are all part of the various ministries that control Cambodia. I mean, this is the national police, this is the ministry, the minister of the council of ministers, the right-hand man of the prime minister, and various sort of governors throughout the country of provinces. This is still pretty outdated. It's 2008, 2007. There's been some developments. This guy's dead. Helicopter crash, lightning, very suspicious. Anyhow, they all play musical chairs sometimes or another. One of the issues that I haven't gotten to talk about is the problem of essentially tourism as a sort of a disincentive to report for a lot of these countries. So tourism in Cambodia is 14% of the economy, right? If you think about it, countries that depend on trade and tourism, for example, are not going to want bad publicity about things happening in their borders, diseases. If they export beef to the US, certainly they're not going to want to say anything about animals having strange diseases and things like that. So it's very bad for business. So tourism becomes a real issue when money is on the line, and certainly a lot of money is on the line in Cambodia on tourism. 14% of the economy is tourism. So that probably drove some of the incentive to not do as much sort of paying attention to what was going on, not report as much. But you can't stop everything. And most recently, this Enterovirus 71 was reported in Cambodia, which killed 64 children. And of course, they were mostly in this hospital that's actually run by a Swiss pediatrician who gets money from donors from Switzerland and other countries. So he's not going to shut up about this. And so it leaked out. And the virus, is actually a pretty common, or it's not an unusual thing, but for some reason it's become very virulent in Cambodia. And this is the scene outside the hospitals this Swiss pediatrician runs. People wait all day to kind of get a number, and if their number is called, they get to go in and get care for their kids. If they don't get their number called, they have to come back the next day. So let me switch quickly to H1N1, because it was really the boogeyman of 2009. And the problem there was that, it was kind of we didn't know what was going on. I mean, we saw deaths in Mexico. It seemed to be quite serious. In fact, if you looked at the mortality rate, if it had anything remotely matching highly pathogenic avian influenza, bird flu, it could have been very, very serious. And even with the relatively mild strain that ended up winning over the more virulent one, this is a clinic in Canada, you had problems with capacity. But one of the things I found when I did my research in Mexico was that the presidential palace there was faced at one point, the president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, was faced at one point in a 3 a.m. meeting in which he has to decide what to do about this. This is very early on. And essentially the choice was to go between China's route or Canada's route in terms of reporting, whether to be transparent about the disease or whether to hide and obfuscate. And thankfully for the world, he went Canada's route. But the disease itself, went pandemic. It's no longer kept track of by the World Health Organization because it's just everywhere at this point. So let me conclude with some remarks on the case of Indonesia and Cambodia, which is the findings of the study that I just published. And talk to you about just share with you some lines from an email I got April 11th, 2010, from a scientist in Indonesia that I met who worked at Namru 2. And this person writes, Namru 2 Jakarta is shutting down. I've been very sad, not only because I'm losing my job, but more than that, Indonesia will lose an established laboratory research because of political reasons. And I think that's really the lesson from the research I've done, namely that politics matters. The fact is, here's a quote from Churchill that I've changed. So Churchill said, scientists should be on top, but not on top. But I don't want to be too mean to scientists. I'll just say technology should be on tap, but not on top. Technology is oftentimes this kind of seen as a panacea of like, oh, just bring the technology and everything will be fine, right? Just create a diagnostic kit and you just need a drop of blood from the patient and then you find out what's going on. Well, it's not so simple. And certainly when you had the best technology with Namru 2, you couldn't actually convince your host to keep you there because they didn't trust what you were doing. They didn't know why you were there. They started speculating about making bioweapons and whatnot, and it went out of control. So that's certainly, that was certainly a concern. Churchill has another quote, of course, much better known. Now this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the beginning, the end of the beginning. And for Namru 2, at least, it's perhaps that end of the beginning. On June 25th, the head of Namru 2 in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, stepped down, and it was supposed to be the head of Jakarta coming in to replace him, this gentleman here, but I don't know, he was diverted. He couldn't actually get there, and so I hope certainly that the lessons from Indonesia and Cambodia with respect to how to work better with your host country will be learned for other labs around the world, because there are like 5 labs across the world that are doing fantastic work and that need to basically be careful about how they operate in order not to repeat the mistakes of Namru 2 in Indonesia.